welcome to the deep dive. Today we're looking at a really significant and quite troubling chapter in American history.
Yeah, we're talking about the interregional slave trade, this huge forced movement of people, mainly between 1790 and 1860.
Right, something like 1 million enslaved people forcibly moved from the southeast down to the southwest.
And it brings up a massive, unsettling question, doesn't it? What was the real engine behind this?
Exactly. Was it, as some historians and even people at the time claimed, a deliberate system in the exporting states, like Virginia or Maryland, like a slave breeding system?
Right.
Frederick Douglass used that chilling phrase, rearing for the market.
Or was it more about the sheer economic pull from the Southwest, just the relentless sale of existing enslaved populations, and that's what shaped the demographics back east?
That's the core of it, and that's what we really want to dig into today.
And to do that, we've got some pretty unique evidence to look at.
Yeah, this is fascinating. It's based on a detailed data set that actually links slave sale records from New Orleans back to the 1830 census.
Which is incredible because it lets us potentially identify who was selling enslaved people and, crucially, when those sales happened relative to when the census was taken.
So our mission today, really, is to use this analysis to get past some of the speculation, to try and understand the demographic causes and, well, the consequences of this trade based on the evidence.
Yes, separating what we can actually see in the data from, the arguments that have been made over the years.
Okay, so let's start with that concept, the slave breeding idea. It's horrific, obviously, but it's central to this whole historical debate.
It is, and it's this idea that the Southeast basically became a supply zone.
Yeah.
Producing enslaved labor specifically for the cotton boom happening in the Deep South.
And you mentioned Frederick Douglass comparing it to livestock breeding. That's such a powerful and damning image.
And it wasn't just abolitionists saying this. You had economic thinkers, like John Cairns, arguing it made economic sense.
How so?
Well, Cairns argued that as tobacco farming depleted the soil in places like Virginia, the land became less profitable for crops.
Okay.
So the argument went the region's main product shifted. It became more profitable to, quote, breed enslaved people for sale to the new fertile cotton lands in the Southwest, where demand for labor was just exploding.
Wow. And we even have accounts from people traveling through the South, right? Like Frederick Olmsted.
Yeah, Olmsted, writing in the mid-1800s, he actually quoted a slaveholder who apparently said, quite openly, that in states like Maryland, Virginia, North Carolina, as much attention is paid to the breeding and growth of Negroes as to that of horses and mules.
That's just chilling. Gives you a real glimpse into the mindset.
It does, but here's the thing. Despite these powerful statements, despite the economic logic some people saw,
Finding direct truth is hard.
exactly. When you look for documented evidence like actual records of systematic, large-scale breeding operations specifically for sale, it's surprisingly scarce.
So historians like Ulrich B. Phillips pointed this out early on.
Yes, Phillips noted the lack of explicit records, and later, Kenneth Stamp in his big study of slavery.
The peculiar institution.
Right. That's the one. Stamp also acknowledged this lack of, detailed plans for forced matings or breeding programs, but he had a more nuanced take.
Okay.
Stamp suggested that maybe direct owner-coerced pairings weren't often written down, perhaps because of the obvious moral issues even then.
Right.
But, he argued, it's entirely plausible that enslaved people were, in his words, reared with an eye to their marketability. The internal slave trade was a huge business.
So even without a smoking gun memo saying breed more slaves, the economic incentive was definitely there. And the trade itself suggests a focus on producing people for sale.
Precisely. And because that direct evidence is elusive, researchers have often turned to indirect clues. Circumstantial evidence.
Like looking at birth rates. I think Richard Such did work on that.
Yes. Such looked at unusually high fertility rates among enslaved women as a possible sign.
Okay.
The approach in the analysis we're focusing on today is a bit different. It looks at the demographics, the characteristics of the slave holdings of the people who are actually selling enslaved individuals.
The idea being, if breeding for the market was common, maybe the slaveholders doing the selling would look different somehow, demographically speaking.
That's the underlying logic, yes. Trying to see if patterns emerge among the sellers.
Okay, so let's shift focus a bit to how this forced movement actually worked on the ground. It wasn't just one thing, right? People were moved in different ways.
That's a crucial point. There were basically two main ways this happened.
Okay, wait, really?
First, you had planters, sometimes whole families. deciding to move west or south, they'd pack up their entire operation, including all the enslaved people they claimed to own.
So still a forced migration, still devastating, but maybe less selective in terms of who went. Like, families might stay together more often.
Generally, yes. That type of migration often moved entire communities, including older people, children, family units. Still horrific, but different from the trade.
And the second way was the trade itself.
Right. The interregional slave trade proper. This was driven by professional slave traders. It was much more targeted, much more brutal in its selection.
But
Traders were buying individuals, often with the specific goal of maximizing profit in the markets of the Deep South, like New Orleans.
and this often meant separating families.
Absolutely. The evidence from the New Orleans market is stark. Most enslaved people arriving there were sold alone, without a spouse, without children present. It highlights the trade's incredibly destructive impact on family bonds.
So that distinction is really important. The planter moving versus the trader buying individuals.
It's fundamental. The trade, by its very nature, treating people purely as commodities, was far more likely to rip families apart.
And these traders, they had specific types of people they were looking for, didn't they? They weren't just buying randomly.
No, definitely not. Research, Pritchett and Chamberlain looked at this. They found traders strongly preferred teenagers and young adults,
Why them specifically?
seen as being in their prime working years, peak productivity. They tended to avoid buying very young children.
Because they couldn't work yet. And
Right.
maybe transport costs and care.
Exactly. Children were seen often as more of a liability during the journey and less immediately valuable in the destination market. So the trade was very selective based on age.
Okay, so if traders are primarily buying and moving teenagers and young adults out of places like Virginia and Maryland, what does that do to the demographics of the people left behind?
Well, think about it. If young adults are leaving, but young children are generally not being sold and moved.
Then the proportion of children relative to the women remaining would go up.
Precisely. The child-woman ratio, the number of children per woman, would naturally tend to rise in those exporting areas.
But is that what the data shows?
Yes. Table 1 in the source material shows this clearly. Between 1820 and 1860, the child-woman ratios in Maryland, North Carolina, and Virginia were consistently higher, maybe 6 to 11% higher than in the South overall.
Okay, so on the surface, that looks like it could support the breeding idea, right? Higher ratio might mean higher birth rates.
It might seem that way initially, but there's another potential explanation.
Ah, okay. What's the alternative theory?
This comes from Fogel and Engerman. They proposed the selective migration hypothesis.
Selective migration.
Their argument was that this higher child-woman ratio might just be a statistical illusion or artifact, not necessarily proof of higher fertility.
How could it be an artifact?
Well, the child-woman ratio calculation includes all women in the denominator, women with children, and women without.
Right.
Fogel and Engerman argued, what if the slave trade disproportionately selected and removed single, childless women? If those women were the ones primarily being sold and moved south.
Then the women left behind would have a higher proportion of mothers among them, mathematically pushing up the ratio.
Exactly. Even if the actual birth rate per mother wasn't any different.
Right.
Because planters moving whole households took women of all statuses, that kind of migration wouldn't skew the ratio in the same way.
Okay, so this is the crux of it. Is the higher ratio in exporting states due to more babies being born, breeding, or is it due to childless women being selectively removed?
That's the key question. And this is where that detailed New Orleans data comes in. It offers a chance to potentially untangle these two possibilities.
Right, because you can see who was sold and link them back to the seller's household before the sale.
Absolutely. So the researcher behind this study used these New Orleans notarial records from 1830. Louisiana law required sales to be notarized, creating this paper trail.
And there was that temporary law, too,
Yeah.
about certificates.
Yes, crucial for this work. A law from 1829 to 1831 required a certificate of good moral character for any enslaved person brought in from out of state to be sold.
And these certificates listed the previous owner and where they were from.
Exactly. Previous owner's name, date of the certificate, and the county where it was issued. It's like a passport almost, connecting the person sold in New Orleans back to their origin.
So that's the link. You match that certificate info to the 1830 census records.
That's the process. They started with thousands of sales in 1830, narrowed it down to those imported with certificates, cleaned up the data, ending up with a sample of about 2,250 sales.
And where were these people coming from mostly?
From all over, 192 counties, but the vast majority, about 78%, came from Virginia, North Carolina, and Maryland, the main exporting states we've been talking about.
Okay. And the sellers, were they mostly big planters? Or,
It was a mix, but professional traders played a huge role. They weren't just individuals selling one or two people. These traders bought from sheriffs handling estates, from small farms, from larger plantations.
so it was a commercial network.
Definitely. The study mentions one trader, James Barnes Diggs, who bought 115 enslaved people from 100 different sellers. That really shows the scale and organization.
And the people being sold in New Orleans, what did their demographics look like compared to the overall population back home?
Very different. Starkly different. Among those 15 and older, men outnumbered women almost 2 to 1, a sex ratio of 1.94.
Wow. Heavily skewed towards men.
And very, very few young children. Children under 10 were about 35% of the total enslaved population back home, but there were less than 4% of those sold in this New Orleans sample.
Less than 4%. That's tiny.
And maybe the most telling statistic, intact families were incredibly rare in the sales. Less than 10% of the adult women were sold with a child.
So the child-woman ratio among those being sold must have been incredibly low.
Extremely low, only 0.11 among the sold population, compared to 1.243 back in the exporting areas.
That massive gap really drives home the point about children being left behind.
It strongly suggests it, yes.
Okay, and then the researchers managed to link many of these specific sales back to the census records of the sellers.
They did. By carefully matching the previous owner names and the counties from the certificates to the 1830 census data, they linked 533 sellers, representing 731 enslaved people sold.
And the timing was important here, right? Whether the sale happened before or after the census date.
Critically important. The census date was June 1st, 1830. By knowing roughly when the sale happened, using the certificate date, they could try to establish cause and effect. Did the seller's demographics before the sale predict if they sold? And did the sale itself change the demographics of the holding afterwards?
Right. So let's get into that analysis. Did they find that slaveholders who had more children, relative to women, a higher child-woman ratio, were actually more likely to sell people? Which would support the breeding idea.
That's what they looked for using regression analysis. Essentially, using selling as a proxy, albeit imperfect, for potential breeding activity.
Yeah, been a result.
Quite the opposite, actually. When they looked at owners whose holdings were recorded before they sold people, i.e. sales after the census date, there was no statistically significant positive link.
No link. So higher fertility didn't mean higher likelihood of selling.
In fact, the coefficient, the statistical indicator, was slightly negative, though not statistically significant. It directly contradicts the simple idea that owners with lots of children were the ones flooding the market.
That is a major finding. To suggest something other than just high fertility was driving the decision to sell.
It really does. And there was another surprising finding related to the sex ratio.
Oh, what was that?
They found a statistically significant positive link between having more men relative to women in a holding and the likelihood of selling someone.
More men meant more likely to sell. That also seems to cut against the breeding hypothesis, doesn't it? You'd think breeders would want to keep more women.
Exactly. And looking deeper into the sales data, confirmed sellers were more likely to sell men than women.
So what does that suggest?
It strongly suggests that the demand side was key. The huge demand for male laborers in the Deep South seemed to override any potential concerns about maintaining a certain gender balance for reproduction back in the exporting states. Market pull was stronger.
Okay, that makes sense. Market forces dictating who gets sold. What about the size of the slaveholding? Did big plantations sell more often than small farms?
The analysis showed that smaller slaveholders, maybe those with fewer than 16 people, were actually less likely to sell anyone overall compared to larger holders.
Less likely. Interesting.
But if a smaller owner did sell, they tended to sell a larger percentage of the people they held.
Ah, okay. So for a smallholder, selling was maybe a bigger, less frequent event, possibly driven by different kinds of economic stress.
That seems plausible, yes. Different pressures, different scales of operation.
So the picture emerging is really quite nuanced. It's not just one single factor like breeding. It's market demand, trader preferences, the seller's circumstances.
A complex interplay of factors. Now, the other side of this analysis was looking at the impact of the sales themselves.
Right. How did selling people change the demographics of the enslaved population that remained behind? particularly that child-woman ratio.
Okay, so for this, they used a mathematical framework, building on Fogel and Engerman's work again, to model how selling men, women with children, and women without children affected the ratio of those left behind.
And what did the statistics show here?
First, they found a strong positive link between the sex ratio of the remaining people and the child-woman ratio. Meaning, if you sell more men than women, the remaining population has a higher proportion of women, which mathematically increases the child-woman ratio. This fits with Fogel and Engerman's selective migration idea.
Okay, that makes sense. But what about the direct impact of selling specific types of people?
This was the crucial part. The analysis found a statistically significant positive impact when childless women were sold.
Selling childless women increased the child-woman ratio of those left.
Yes. Removing women without children from the denominator makes the ratio of children to remaining women go up. The study estimated selling, say, half the childless women could bump the ratio up by quite a bit, maybe 0.5.
Wow, that's a substantial effect.
It is. And conversely, selling mothers with their children had a statistically significant negative effect on the remaining ratio, which also makes sense.
And selling men.
Selling men didn't show a statistically significant impact on the child-woman ratio itself in this analysis.
So the big takeaway here seems to be the selective removal of childless women via the trade was a major driver of those higher child-woman ratios we saw earlier.
That's what this evidence strongly points to. It wasn't necessarily more births, but fewer childless women counted in the ratio in the exporting states because they'd been sold south.
And they did a check on this, right? A falsification test.
Yes, a clever check. They looked at sales that happened after the census was taken on June 1st, 1830, and those later sales had no statistical effect on the child-woman ratio recorded in the census. Which makes sense. If the sale happened after the count, it couldn't have caused the ratio recorded on June 1st.
So that really strengthens the argument that sales before the census were causing the demographic shift observed in the census data.
It strongly supports that causal link, yeah.
Okay, this is compelling at the individual holding level. But can this mechanism selling childless women actually explain the big regional differences in child-woman ratios between the exporting states and the rest of the South?
That's the next logical question. To address it, the researcher used another model, estimating the regional ratio based on migration patterns.
What went into that model?
Things like the overall southern child-woman ratio, the very low ratio we saw among those sold to traders, an assumed ratio for people moving with planters, the observed ratio in the exporting states, and the overall rate women were leaving those states.
And what did the model suggest? Could the trade alone explain the difference?
The calculation suggested that if the slave trade accounted for somewhere around 69% of all the adult women migrating out of the exporting states, then the underlying fertility rates in those exporting states could actually have been the same as in the rest of the South.
Wow. So the sheer volume and the selectivity of the trade could potentially account for the entire observed difference in child-woman ratios without needing higher birth rates.
That's what the model indicates is plausible, yes. The scale of the trade itself, removing certain women, could create that demographic signature.
Now, the study does note it's hard to pin down that exact percentage, the 69% figure, right? Different historians have different estimates for the scale of the trade versus planter migration.
Absolutely. There's uncertainty there. Estimates vary. But the modeling shows that if the trade was indeed responsible for a large majority of female migration, as many historians believe, then selective migration becomes a very powerful explanation for the demographic patterns.
It really shifts the focus towards the mechanics and scale of the trade itself.
It does. And there's another layer to this, a really tragic one.
Which is?
The focus on selling childless women might obscure the reality of mothers being separated from their children.
How so?
Well, traders wanted prime-age, marketable individuals. A mother in her 20s or 30s was valuable. Her young child, maybe under 10, was less so in the trader's eyes.
So the trader might buy the mother but leave the child behind.
Exactly. There was actually a Louisiana law from 1806 attempting to prohibit the separate sale of children under 10 from their mothers in Louisiana, but that didn't apply back in Virginia or Maryland, where the initial purchase often happened.
And we have accounts confirming this practice, don't we?
Yes, that conversation Ethan Allen Andrews recorded with the slave trader is powerful. The trader basically admitted that while he tried to keep families together when he sold them, when he was buying them back east, separation was common. He'd buy the mother, and the children might be kept by the original owner or sold elsewhere.
That's just heartbreaking. And it adds another dimension to the child-woman ratio, doesn't it?
It does. Some of that higher ratio in the exporting states could literally be the result of children left behind when their mothers were sold south, artificially inflating the count of children relative to the women who remained.
A demographic echo of family destruction.
A truly grim possibility. It highlights the human cost behind these cold statistics.
So wrapping this up, if we look back at our central question, breeding versus sales, what's the main takeaway from this deep dive?
I think the key finding, supported quite strongly by this analysis, is that while we can't definitively rule out any instance of slave breeding, the evidence suggests it wasn't the primary driver of the demographic patterns we see. Instead, the higher child-woman ratios in the exporting states seem largely to be a direct consequence of the interregional slave trade itself, specifically its selective nature.
The selling of childless women and also the likely separation of mothers from children who were deemed less marketable.
Exactly. Those two factors, driven by the economics of the trade, appear to be the more significant forces shaping the demographics observed in the data.
So the conclusion leans towards slave sales, fueled by that massive demand for labor in the Southwest, being the more dominant factor in shaping the Upper South's enslaved population demographics, rather than a widespread systematic practice of breeding for the market.
That appears to be where the evidence presented here points. And it really underscores the sheer brutality of the trade.
Yeah, it wasn't just the forced migration, the movement itself. It was the calculated disruption of families, the commodification of people based on age and perceived value.
And how those cold calculations literally changed the structure of populations, leaving these demographic scars we can still analyze today. This kind of detailed look at the records gives us a much deeper, if more painful, understanding of how that system operated.
It certainly does. A stark reminder of the complex and devastating interplay between economics and human lives. Thank you for joining me for this deep dive.
Thank you. It leaves you thinking about how these historical processes continue to resonate, doesn't it?